President Trump was not at the Nazi white supremacist demonstrations in Charlottesville this weekend, but he speaks as if he was walking among those people and knows what they were thinking.
Well, those people, all of those people, excuse me, I've condemned neo-Nazis. I've condemned many different groups, but not all of those people were neo-Nazis, believe me. Not all of those people were white supremacists by any stretch. Those people were also there because they wanted to protest the taking down of a statue, Robert E. Lee. So, this week it's Robert E. Lee. I noticed that Stonewall Jackson's coming down. I wonder, is it George Washington next week? And is it Thomas Jefferson the week after? You know, you really do have to ask yourself, where does it stop? But they were there to protest, excuse me. You take a look the night before, they were there to protest the taking down of the statue of Robert E. Lee.
And so we now have a president who sees no moral or historical difference between Robert E. Lee and George Washington or Thomas Jefferson. They were all slave owners, but Robert E. Lee was the only one who was willing to go to war and kill hundreds of thousands of Americans to preserve his right to own slaves and to sell slaves, to sell a child's mother to one buyer and that mother's children to other buyers. There is absolutely no shadow of a legal doubt that Robert E. Lee was guilty of treason, and an editorial on June 4th, 1865 in the New York Times insisted that Robert E. Lee should be charged with treason, saying, quote, "He has levied war against the United States more strenuously than any other man in the land, and thereby has been specially guilty of the crime of treason as defined in the Constitution of the United States." The Times went on to say whether General Lee should be hung or not is a minor question. 3 days later, Robert E. Lee was, in fact, indicted for treason. His opponent in the Civil War, fellow West Point graduate General Ulysses S. Grant, interceded with President Andrew Johnson to drop the treason case against Robert E. Lee. President Johnson was very much in favor of prosecuting Lee for treason, but General Grant, who was much more popular with the public, told the president that he would resign from the Army in a public protest of a treason prosecution of Robert E. Lee. And so President Johnson backed down and got the federal prosecutors to drop the case. Robert E. Lee had a choice. He could have been the commander of the United States Army in the Civil War or the commander of the Confederate Army. He made the wrong choice. It wasn't just because he was a Virginian. 40% of Virginia's officers in the U.S. military remained in service to the United States Army and fought in the Civil War on the Union side against their home state of Virginia, 40% of them. Members of Robert E. Lee's own family sided with the North over Virginia and the South. His sister chose the North, and her son joined the Union Army. General Lee did not just fight for the Confederacy. He fought for slavery. He believed in it. He believed slavery should be allowed in the new territories of the United States and that the abolition of slavery should be forbidden. He went to court to personally fight to keep slaves who had been promised their freedom in his father-in-law's will. Some people want to keep Robert E. Lee statues standing because they don't know these things about General Lee, and others want to keep those statues standing because they do know these things about General Lee. They do know that General Lee owned slaves and fought for slavery. Even after the Civil War, General Lee did everything he could to prevent black people from getting the right to vote because he believed in their inferiority and in his own superiority. Robert E. Lee believed in white supremacy. Because Robert E. Lee made the wrong choice, more soldiers died in the Civil War on both sides. A less skilled commander of the Confederate Army would have lost the war sooner for the South, saving lives on both sides. Donald Trump knows none of this and never will. Donald Trump and his White House and his presidential campaign are under investigation tonight for, among other things, collusion with Russia. If Donald Trump is proved to be guilty of collusion with Russia to steal the presidency, there won't be any statues of President Trump in this country. But there might still be statues of Robert E. Lee, who committed treason and then forced America into its bloodiest war. General Lee's troops killed at least 360,000 Union soldiers, and General Lee led about 260,000 Confederate soldiers to their deaths. And Robert E. Lee got away with all that. But he left a legacy that continues to kill Americans today.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.